have to be a trusted institution. And that's what I feel KET is and represents in the mind of so many Kentuckians. KET, through different means, shares our mission at the University of Kentucky. We want to reach as many people as possible, serve as many people as possible to advance Kentucky. KET is one of those institutions that serves as a sort of nervous system in a way. It listens to Kentucky and it speaks to Kentucky in remote corners of the state, in some of our largest cities. So to have that kind of rich source, dependable, reliable, it's invaluable.
When people think of Compton, what do they think of?
Welcome to Kentucky Tonight. I'm Renee Shaw. Thank you so much for joining us. Our topic this evening, Senate Bill 150 and LGBTs. The Kentucky General Assembly passed Senate Bill 150 earlier in the year. It includes a ban on gender-affirming medical care for trans youth, and it lets teachers use a pronoun aligned with a student's biological sex, even if that goes against the student's wishes. The ACLU of Kentucky is asking a judge to block the health care section of that bill before it goes into effect on June 29th. Now, the latest dispute is over the use of the word "or" in one part of SB 150. The law bans any instruction on human sexuality in grades K through 5 or instruction on gender identity or sexual orientation for all grades. The Kentucky Department of Education says the use of the conjunction "or" instead of "and" means schools can still do one or the other. I talked to Education Commissioner Jason Glass last week about that interpretation when I interviewed him last Thursday. Commissioner Glass, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Renee. It's great to be here.
So let's talk about the conjunction "or," which has gotten more media headlines than I think any other word that we know of. Senate Bill 150's language, you all have used the word "or" to allow for school districts to decide about teaching sexual orientation and gender identity. Is that the case?
Well, that's the language that's in the bill. So it wasn't our determination to use the word "or." That's the de facto language that is in the statute now. So we've issued two sets of guidance related to this. The first set of guidance didn't point out that difference. And then we started hearing from attorneys that represent school districts and associations that represent school districts, and they really pointed out that error in the law. We now know it's an error just based on the reaction that we're seeing from the Senate GOP and the Kentucky GOP. But it's been brought to us by those attorneys and pointing out that that's an error.
Well, Senator Max Wise, who is the sponsor of Senate Bill 150, says that it's a warped interpretation to wiggle yourself out of the law, and he called it, quote, an absurd effort to skirt state law. So that seems to run counter to what you were just saying about their reaction. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think I would disagree with Senator Wise. It's what the law says. I mean, they're the ones that wrote "or" into the statute. So it would be a warped interpretation to call "or" an "and." Instead. It's clear that the legislators made an error here, and the right thing for them to do, when I make an error, I accept responsibility for it, and I go about straightening it out. And they have the opportunity to do that in the next session. I'm sure they'll correct this error, but to point at the Department of Education and me and say, "You caused this," that's completely false. We weren't involved in the drafting or the process of the bill at all, and it was rushed through at the last minute. So it's almost surprising there aren't more errors with the speed and under cover of darkness that this moved through.
Have other errors been found? Or I guess they would have already been revealed at this particular point had they been found.
Well, we've got lots of conflicts with school best practices, with federal law, with possible constitutional questions. So all of those things are going to come out as this gets implemented, probably to be solved in the courts. Or as challenges rise up, we may see the legislature go back at this and make adjustments to it. So that'll all have to be determined. There's a lot that we don't know right now. In our guidance, we've tried to point out for school districts some of those complexities, to say here's some things you need to be thinking about in terms of best practice in taking care of your students. Here's where it conflicts with federal law, so you need to be aware of that. Here's where it may cause a constitutional issue. And really it's going to be up to the districts to determine how they handle those issues.
So you mentioned, I think, that Republicans have acknowledged that this was an error. Who's acknowledged that it was an error, and are they owning up to it?
Well, it doesn't seem like they're owning up to it. They're pointing out that their intent was for it to be and, but that, of course, is not what it says. So we're merely quoting the exact language that is in the bill that says or. And so I would say, based on their reaction, their intent was for it to be and. So the right thing for them to do is in the next session to go in and correct the error.
So in the meantime, what should happen? I mean, if it's an error and it's so much interpretation or possible litigation that many could fear, should they even comply at all? And would there be penalties for that?
What we've provided is non-regulatory guidance, so it doesn't have the force of law. It doesn't direct districts to do anything. It merely advises them, here's the landscape in which this policy is going to have to be implemented, and some things for districts to think about. So ultimately, it's going to be up to them to consult with their own attorneys, think about their own risks, what's in the best interest of their students, what's the right context in their community, and then make a determination about what's best for them.
Are you hearing that they're concerned about litigation, either way they interpret the law?
Yes, and I think they should be, because again, we've got conflicts with best practice, we've got conflicts with federal law, we've got conflicts with possible constitutional issues, all of which are going to depend on how this is actually implemented and what happens. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to have to see how this rolls out over the next couple of years to see what cases emerge. There already have been some filed against elements of Senate Bill 150, so we'll see how those play out, but there are really multiple points at which this law could be challenged.
So to make it plain, what does your guidance give school districts the permission to do?
Well, it merely says that when it comes to adopting a policy around topics related to gender identity, sexual identity, or maturation, that there's a choice that districts have, and that is either they can exclude it for students under grade 5, so 6 and up, or they can exclude it for everyone. And so that or is the operative term that's in there. And so we've seen some school districts look at that and decide they're going to choose between one of those because the law does give them that ability. Mm-hmm. Others are wrestling with, do they go ahead and do both because they're hearing from the legislature that they probably are going to correct this when they get back together. Mm-hmm. So we're really going to have to see how school districts and the attorneys that support them decide how they're going to handle this.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Glass. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So now, joining us to discuss this by Skype, State Senator Max Wise, a Republican from Campbellsville and the sponsor of Senate Bill 150. In our Lexington studio, we have Chris Hartman, Executive Director of the Fairness Campaign, Richard Nelson, founder and executive director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, and Rebecca Blankenship, executive director of Band Conversion Therapy Kentucky. We want to hear from you tonight, so send us your questions and comments by Twitter at KYTonight, KET. Send an email to kytonight@ket.org, or use the web form at ket.org/kytonight, or you can simply give us a call at 1-800-494-7605. Well, welcome to all of our guests near and a little further away. Senator Wise, I want to come to you first because we heard your name mentioned a few times during that interview with Commissioner Glass, and I want to ask you about your response, and particularly, do you acknowledge the language is at best murky, and do you anticipate the Kentucky General Assembly enacting some cleanup language to clarify the intent of what was passed in Senate Bill 150?
First, Renee, thank you for having me on tonight. Based off of the interview you did there with Commissioner Glass, I think first we're looking at bureaucratic activism at its finest. I think what we've got here is Governor Andy Brashear has appointed a commissioner here to this position who's got far left-leaning ideas and his ideals and values that he's put forth, and issuing that of the intent of the law is what it says there. And also with that, I thought it was interesting him talking about when mistakes are made that he himself has corrected those mistakes. I wonder where he was. Was there a correction or an acknowledgement of his comments towards our Kentucky teachers? When he told them they need to look for jobs if they're not following the guidance of KDEs related to a lot of the issue of curriculum that he was trying to push out through the Kentucky Department of Education. And in terms of your second follow-up there, Renee, if we go back and change that, exactly. I mean, there's always times that, the legislative intent, if we go back and we look at statutes and if there needs to be revisions or corrections, we always can do that in the next, session. And I will say this, how many times we talk about bureaucratic activism, could we go through multiple laws that are out there? If we're nitpicking and trying to find words and meanings and things such as that, there's probably a whole lot of case law that we could go back to and try to interpret the way that maybe a bureaucrat wishes to do so instead of following the intent of the legislative body.
So was it the actual intent, or was it the language that was inserted to give school districts an option? I mean, was it really intentional for it to be an or?
What you had is House Committee Sub 1 was put into Senate Bill 150, and it followed the democratic process, went through every stage just like any bill does as it relates there. What we did, all those portions of Senate Bill 150 that you saw in the final product were portions of Senate bills, my original Senate Bill 150, and then you had also House bills that were merged there into House Committee Sub 1. And so, attorneys, drafters, and so forth were put into, that merger of the House Committee Sub 1 as it was brought forth with the House Education Committee.
So this question came in from Teresa Gilbert from LaRue County while the interview with Commissioner Glass was playing, and it's directed to you, Senator Wise, and it says, the Kentucky Department of Education is ignoring the law, SB 150, enacted in March. What legislation are you working on with legislators this summer that will add consequences to SB 150 for refusing to obey the law?
Well, I'll say this, if you go back to the original intent of Senate Bill 150, I drafted with our LRC bill drafters that portion of 150 a year ago. That was done in June and also in July after a meeting that took place between legislators and Commissioner Glass that took place in the annex in kind of a closed session meeting. And we talked about some of the concerns that we were hearing from superintendents, school administrators, and parents as related to this gingerbread person toolkit that was being put forth. And so, we told him we wanted that taken off of the website of the KDE. And also we had the question about pronoun usage and keeping things quiet from parents. And so that's when we started, or I started working on that first portion of Senate Bill 150. In terms of working on things right now, I can't speak for other legislators. I have not yet had a meeting with any type of bill drafter yet. But that is the beauty of the interim. That's part of the process that we can go through and see if there's other House members or other senators that may want to themselves have a change to this, or maybe we add other things to that as well.
Miss Blankenship, welcome to Kentucky Tonight. I think this is your first time on, so we appreciate you being here. So given the conversation where we are right now, you've been following this bill, you've been working against this bill when it was up before the Kentucky General Assembly. Do you feel, well, first of all, did you agree with the language as it was written in 150, and do you believe that this conjunction of or provides an out that you think will give school districts some options?
Well, thanks for having me on, Renee. I'll say first, I strongly disagree with the intentions of Senate Bill 150, and I think we'll talk about that more in a moment. But concerning this particular law, my advice to Senator Wise would be not to write one the night before he passes it, like a drunk college student banging out a paper. The reality here is that our judicial system must rely upon textual interpretations of law. If we disregard textualism, we are licensing the courts to use instead the kind of judicial activism that the Republican Party has spent the last 3 years decrying at every opportunity. When we have to go back to a precedent from 1952 to justify interpreting an or as an and in a decision written by Justice Bert T. Combs, a liberal justice, it's very shocking to see the majority party depart from the principles that they've articulated just as soon as that opportunity is available. And I will say this about KDE. I actually don't think that they're super committed to LGBT rights. I had a conversation with Dr. Glass pretty recently where I expressed my dismay that the first round of guidance about Senate Bill 150 had gone significantly beyond, in my view, the language of the law by requiring that schools end gay, straight alliances and other LGBT after-school clubs. I think that it's a positive step that KDE is moving closer to a textualist interpretation, and I believe that all of our government institutions should do that.
Senator Wise, I want to come back to you because I understand you want to chime in here.
Well, first, I'd take criticism of what was being said about a drunken college student the night before. I think that's out of line. To first of all try to make a comparison of me or my colleagues that is how we were the night before. We do this all the time. The bill went through the legislative process. went through the democratic process. Every portion of that bill had either been pre-filed, filed, or had been out in the general public for them to see. So, what was put forth, yes, it may have came, after what happened with House Bill 490 on the floor, as it was put on the clerk's desk. But, we do this all the time in terms of merging and putting House committee subs, into Senate bills and vice versa.
So, Mr. Hartman, thank you for being here as well. I want to come to you because someone I talked to about this bill today, in talking about the use of the or and where its placement, made an analogy of it's like saying, well, I don't want you to sit on the couch or the chair. Right? I don't want you to sit on either one of them. It's not an either or. It's not an either. And it's none of them. Why do you not interpret that to be, or do you interpret that to be the case in SB 150 in this particular section?
I agree very much with Dr. Glass's assessment of that conjunction. And I find it so funny. Senator Wise, the others, they've got egg all over their face right now because this could have been caught. But for, like everyone is saying, this was passed under the cloak of darkness, in the middle of the night.
Wild-eyed liberals.
They were drafting this, throwing everything they could to create this Frankenstein monster of anti-fairness bills combined into one. And of
Max
course,
Wise
they made
was telling the
mistakes
truth.
because nobody read it. They didn't debate it. They didn't know
Oh,
what was
that's
in it.
nonsense.
And so they created this situation where schools do get a choice.
No, they
Do
don't
you
have a
either
choice.
not teach about human sexuality under 6th grade, or do you not talk about LGBTQ issues from kindergarten all the
You
way
don't
through
do neither.
senior year of high school?
That's
We don't
the
like
intent
either
of the
option.
I
law
was going to say, do
completely.
you care for either option?
Of course, I hate
Right.
both options, but it has given schools a choice because of this grammatical error.
They
And
do
is
not
that
have a
pleasing to you
choice.
that the schools have a choice? I mean, to what end does it do for your cause? I guess
It's
is the
not very
question.
pleasing to me, but I am glad that at least one of those things has the opportunity to be taught in Kentucky schools because they are both vital. Kids should have instruction in human sexuality and consent.
Oh,
and personal
nonsense.
space in our bodies well before 6th grade. And you should be able to talk about LGBTQ issues from kindergarten through 12th grade.
Mr. Nelson, you've been on this program before and we've talked about this very issue. So given where we were when we left off, now we've gotten the KDE guidance, revised guidance, and we have an ACLU of Kentucky lawsuit that we'll talk about in just a moment. Where do you think that this was written solidly enough where the intent was made very clear and there should be no confusion?
I think it was. I think the intent of the
Absolutely.
legislature was clear as far as restricting what can be taught in K through 5 classrooms, about what's appropriate to teach grades 6 through 12. Bathroom policy, that's a bill that was introduced going back to 2015. It's come up several times since then. Another portion of the bill restricts puberty blockers and gender transition surgeries. That has been introduced the last 3 sessions in a row. There's no secret about this legislation. This come up in front of committee.
Absolutely.
It's been debated and dialogued. One of the new provisions,
The
and one
liberal
reason
Andy
why this
Brashear
has been
and this
introduced,
commissioner,
Senator Wise pointed this out,
self-appointed,
was because of the
not elected by
guidance
the
that
people.
Kentucky Department of Education issued last summer that suggested that public school teachers use the preferred gender pronouns of students and keep it secret from parents if the child wishes.
That's
that.
right.
Now, this has led to some of the school districts that have interpreted that as direction instead of guidance. We do know of situations where public school teachers have left the profession. I'm thinking of Randy Adams, the former principal in Anderson County High School, who had an issue with keeping something secret from parents. When he talked to the superintendent there in Anderson County, he was put in and shared his concerns. He was eventually put on administrative leave. He determined that he could not continue to teach in accordance with his conscience. Here's the takeaway, Renee. Our schools should not be placed where gender identity activism and sexual orientation is introduced at very young grades. And because of the interpretation, the guidance offered right now, it opens the door to precisely that in grades K through 5. This is the thing that parents are upset about.
Shame on
This is
them.
what the legislature responded to.
We heard Commissioner Glass say that this is just guidance.
Right.
That there doesn't seem to be any repercussions for following it or not following it. This comment from
Nonsense.
Marita, no
Renee.
name assigned to it, and then I'll get to you, I think, Senator Wise. If we would not allow, quote unquote from the viewer, if we would not allow minors to decide about alcohol and tobacco, why would we allow them to decide about gender-altering surgeries and treatments? I'll go to Mr. Hartman first, and then I'll come to you, Senator Wise.
Oh my, this again. So the reality is that for a child to receive gender-affirming health care, the first gender-affirming health care that most children receive is talk therapy, is working with a mental health care professional to talk about what their gender identity is, to talk about how they are identifying, who they know that they are. And it is only when puberty is getting ready to hit that in consultation with a pediatric endocrinologist, and or the child's pediatrician,
Nonsense.
and the mental health
This is what their
professionals,
parents
and
should
the
do.
child's parents, because when we're
Not
talking
the
about this
teachers,
issue, we're talking
not
about
the
parents'
indoctrinators.
rights as well. Only then are puberty-blocking drugs at times administered, prescribed for trans kids, and then at some point in time, several years later, perhaps hormone replacement therapy. This is proven safe and effective and medically necessary treatment and supported by every single major medical association in the United States of America who have filed a friend of the court brief for the ACLU of Kentucky's lawsuit. I mean, why?
The American Civil Liberties Union, the pornography industry.
Literally every major medical association of the United States of America.
Rebecca Blankenship, hold on just a moment. Rebecca Blankenship, are gender or sex change operations happening to minors in Kentucky right now?
No, ma'am, quite the opposite. And every LGBT organization in the Commonwealth said that we were absolutely fine with banning those sorts of surgeries for minors. You know, we might as well ban unicorn attacks. It makes no difference. You know, the reality is that the proponents of this kind of legislation have to lie about it, have to lie about what treatment kids are actually receiving, what this entails, because they do not believe in gender identity at all. They don't think that that somebody who's suffering from gender dysphoria.
I believe this is a guy trying to be a woman right here.
They're advocates of
Goodness
conversion.
gracious sakes
I
alive.
really think it's a shame that we've cut off all of the medical options that families have to
You
keep
know,
their kids
make your
safe.
decisions for your life with
Kentucky
you and your
standards deserve
parents.
better.
Don't try to
And
force
this
it on
is not
other
it.
children
Senator Wise, I'll
and
come
in
to
our
you and I'll come to you,
schools.
Mr. Nelson.
Thanks, Renee. I want to go back real quickly. You mentioned about the guidance, and that's what that is. It is from Kentucky Department of Education. They are not legislators, especially with Commissioner Glass. And once again, when we're just getting into, almost mental gymnastics that the commissioner and also the governor want to play just skirting the law. And I'll say this, they got the guidance right back in mid-April. I think it was around April 17th, if I'm not correct. Then they wait almost 2 months later, the first week of June, and now put out after they got with more attorneys to see, well, what else can we start to pick and what else can we start to find? So all you've done is confuse school districts. You've confused superintendents. Getting ready to, right now we're getting the portion of the middle of summer nearly soon, and we're having to once again go back to this. If I'm a school district, I'm following the law. I'm not following the guidance that was put out there, by the Kentucky Department of Education under Commissioner Glass.
That's
So
right.
before we come to you, Mr.
And I
Nelson,
wouldn't
earlier
either.
today I did talk with David Walls, who's the executive director of the Family Foundation of Kentucky. They were very active on Senate Bill 150. Here's his thoughts about the KDE guidance. David Walls with the Family Foundation, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Renee.
What are the Family Foundation's objections to the KDA guidance on SB 150?
We're very concerned about the really absurd guidance that they provided in this updated guidance, where they're essentially encouraging school districts to not follow the law. The idea that the legislature in these important provisions and protections for kids gave school districts a choice as to what portion of the law would be followed is pretty ridiculous. And we know this is the case because their original guidance on April 17th on this section just gave a plain reading of the provisions. This was well understood by advocates on both sides, by lawmakers, by the debate that happened when this was on the floor.
Absolutely.
So really, it's unfortunate to see a continued politicization of the KDE putting out guidance and encouraging school districts to essentially not follow important provisions of SB 150.
We will have heard from Commissioner Jason Glass that it was upon a second review by the attorneys where they found that language to present some problems and potential lawsuits for school districts. Does that not hold any kind of persuasion in your view? Do you believe it's an intentional dodging of the law by issuing this guidance?
We absolutely do, and unfortunately,
Absolutely, and I do too.
Renee may be aware there has been a series of very politicized guidance put out by the KDE under Commissioner Glass. This goes back to prior to the last school year, where they put out the guidance on pronoun usage that trampled on parental rights. Some of the provisions in SB 150 specifically had to be were included because of some of the problems in the previous guidance as it related to parental rights. And so now, unfortunately, the KDE is once again given in to the demands of LGBTQ advocates who have been demanding that SB 150 not be followed, really from the moment that it was first passed. And so I have every reason to believe that when you put an initial guidance out that's a plain reading of what the law requires, and then you hear from advocates telling you to not follow the law and to look for ways around the law, and then you put out an updated guidance saying that it's pretty clear what's going on here.
What has been the Family Foundation's support and the arguments that you've made in support of SB 150? All along, the Family Foundation's been very vocal in support of this legislation. Why?
Yeah, there's several important parts of this bill as it relates to the guidance and the issue we've been talking about here. These are just very straightforward provisions, broadly supported, that simply just say that we shouldn't teach children in K through 5 human sexuality or sex education topics, not appropriate at all. And then if they're taught in grade 6 and above, that parents need to have the ability to review and opt in. And then also an important protection that says we're not in favor of indoctrinating our children on radical gender ideology in any grade level.
Right.
These are important protections. We know, unfortunately, that some of these topics have been taught in age inappropriate ways in school. So these provisions are age appropriate protections for kids that empower parents. And so it's very important from our perspective to ensure that this law is followed, that schools are encouraged to follow the law, and it's why we have been encouraging our
advocates.
And
as former superintendent of education, the last elected one,
Glass,
I support the
governor,
Family Foundation.
Contact the KDE to encourage them to drop this guidance, and we've had almost 20,000 messages that have been sent. This issue is really resonating with people across Kentucky to see the law followed.
There are some concerns about the language when it comes to discussion of sexually transmitted diseases, and even as far as helping young girls understand the biological changes that are happening to their body when it comes to menstruation. Do you believe that that is too far? Is that right in line with what the Family Foundation would support?
So if you're talking about human sexuality, sometimes sex education topics, again, SB 150 just says that those topics are not appropriate in elementary school, leaves those decisions up to school districts in grades 6 through 12, but simply just requires that school districts get an affirmative opt-in from parents. And so
absolutely. It should not be done without parents' written approval
for school districts in Kentucky, and so I think it would allow local school districts to make decisions about what they think should be taught, but just simply ensure that parents are informed and have the opportunity to have a say.
David Walls, thank you so very much from the Family Foundation. We appreciate a few moments of your time.
Renee, appreciate the opportunity as always to talk with you.
Mr. Hartman, I want to come to you and ask you, because it seemed that perhaps Mr. Walls intimated that maybe there were attorneys who were a part of the Fairness Campaign or even Ban Conversion Therapy who were colluding with the Kentucky Department of Education attorneys to find some objectionable language to issue
Sure
this
they
guidance.
were.
Can you set the record straight there?
I've never spoken with Commissioner Glass. No one on our board has, to my knowledge. I don't even know that I've ever been in the same room with it. But the verbiage is there in black and white. You don't need an attorney to look at the verbiage of the law and see that it clearly states either or.
Mr. Nelson.
There are several court rulings that address this topic. There's at least 5 in Kentucky. I'm looking at one called Commonwealth v. Bartholomew that said, part of the ruling said this: when necessary to effectuate obvious intentions of the legislature, constructive words can be construed as disjunctive and vice versa. Duncan v. Wiseman determined the word "and" in the statute should be construed as "or" and vice versa whenever necessary to effectuate obvious legislative intent and accomplish purpose of object of the statute. And I think that if the KDE attorneys did that, they would have clearly not revised their guidance. They would have left their original guidance they gave out on April the 17th in place. And really, they went out on a limb. If I could add this, Renee, it would have been more helpful to everybody if they had stayed with the original guidance and let the local school board attorneys figure this out, because it's not
Because they still have to figure it out.
They still have to figure it out, but it's not helping anybody. It was very clear that the legislature, in a bipartisan fashion, in the House and Senate, passed this bill into law.
Yeah, but that's not what
supermajorities. Supermajorities. It was eventually, when Governor Brashear vetoed it, it was overridden. The reason why that happened was because parents were deeply concerned about what was happening in public schools. Age-inappropriate curriculum, bathroom policies that were confusing, gender ideology that really could have no part of the Kentucky Department of Education's mission.
In no way
we're lagging, Chris, we are lagging behind in educational attainment. The Annie A. Casey Foundation just issued its report recently. 69% of fourth graders are not reading to grade level. I believe it's 79% of 8th graders are not at grade level in math. We are not focusing on the basics.
The fact that they passed a hateful piece of legislation and now they're seeking justification for doing so.
This is not a hateful piece of legislation, sir. Shame on you.
How is this?
So Senator Wise,
Richard.
Senator Wise, I do want to come to you because there are many who say that these types of bills that have circulated through many general assemblies have come from groups, conservative groups like ALEC, that these are just fill-in-the-blank pieces of legislation that aren't really driven, perhaps, by constituent concern. Answer that for us, if you will.
You know, Renee, when I first started drafting Senate Bill 150, I did not have the work of any lobbyist group. I had the work of myself, and I had the work of our Senate Education Policy Advisor working with the bill drafter. You know, what we passed with Senate Bill 150 ended up becoming actually a copy that other states started looking at of what we did, because we had made a very ominous bill. Now, I know it's been framed as it being the most, detrimental bill of all time. It's the most hateful bill, but it also was the strongest bill for parental communication. It was a bill to protect our children, and it was a bill to, ultimately show where we stand in terms of parental rights in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so I did not personally work with any of the organizations that you mentioned just then. House Committee Sub 1, as it was put forth, once again, those were legislators that had their own separate bill. I'm not going to comment on behalf of them because they're not here on the show. And, when that was put forth, I don't know who they may have worked with if it was on their own. But a lot of those bills, and I think we've said here tonight, bathroom bill, C.B. Embry, one of my colleagues who previously worked on that years ago in the legislative chambers. Representative Wesley put his bill in November that dealt with bathroom privacy, and Representative Deckers was introduced in February. Representative Bakers was introduced in January.
Amen.
So these bills were out there for the general public and for others to see and to follow. And I'll also say this: I did not have any lobbyists representing the LGBTQ community come and talk to me about Senate Bill 150 in its initial stage. I have an open door policy. Now, I've had constituents and I've had others that were activists that want to come talk to me. They came to my office. But there was not a single lobbyist in terms of those issues that was in Senate Bill 150 that ever came to me to talk about the legislative process.
So, Miss Blankenship, I want to ask you, did you or anyone aligned with your group try to talk to Senator Max Wise about Senate Bill 150?
We certainly did. Our lobbyist, Michael Frazier, was in communication with Max Wise several times, has been in communication with him as recently as yesterday, as I understand it. He is lying when he says that we did not come to him to talk about that bill. And I'd like to address something that Mr. Nelson said a minute ago.
You're the liar, ma'am.
Way is this bill hateful? The reality is that these groups are making efforts to conflate LGBT identity with sexually explicit content. That is simply untrue. I think that everybody on this panel agrees that sexually explicit content should not be in our schools, whether it is gay or straight or lesbian or interracial couple porn like Senator Howell is liked on Twitter. The reality is we I submitted written testimony on behalf of Banned Conversion Therapy Kentucky in favor of Senate Bill 5 because I thought that it was generally fair as a school board member and as a parent that we do something identity and viewpoint neutral to remove sexually explicit content from our schools. But there's no reason to engage in discrimination to specifically target gay people and trans people, to suggest that our lives and our very existence, discussion of which is inappropriate. Just to try to knock out sexual content. And by the way, I would like to point out that any bill provision that leans on the word prurient is likely unconstitutional, thanks to existing Supreme Court case law, Brockett versus Spokane Arcades of 1985. When groups like the Commonwealth Policy Center and the Family Foundation tell legislators that they can write bills this way, they're ignoring existing federal law, which surely they ought to know about. They've been caught lying before, but this time it has the added effect of discrediting our General Assembly by forcing them into a constitutional fight that they will not win.
So this comment from Louisville, quote, "My son committed suicide, died by suicide 6 months ago. Before we got home from the funeral, we were receiving hate mail over his status as trans. These activist laws are not from a groundswell of concern, but a concerted effort to demonize the most marginalized group. The speakers supporting this keep talking about rights and politicization of an issue, which is ironic." Senator Max Wise, I'll come to you for a comment, a response to that comment from a Louisville viewer, and any other comments you care to make.
Well, Renee, I'll say, anytime any youth commits suicide, we're seeing the rise in suicide, and that's been over the past few years. We worked on the school safety bill, and we looked at the rise of suicide, over the last 5, 10 plus years. It is a concern, and I'm looking forward to this interim where we're focused on school safety funding that can look at issues such as this. But we've also got a rise of social media bullying. We've also got a rise of societal problems that relate to physical and situations involving the home. I think that we can't just put one issue and say this is the reason. There's so many things that are out there. My heart breaks for any family that loses a child, from suicide or from death.
The reality is that they just don't care. And that Senator Wise cared the minute he started running for lieutenant governor. And he and his running mate, Kelly Craft, played trans kids as their political pawns. And what did they get for it?
Shame on you.
A miserable third place in the race. And now we've got the worst anti-trans law in the entire country that is inevitably going to lead to higher depression and suicide rates amongst our transgender kids in Kentucky. And once again, they could not care less.
Mr. Nelson,
thank you. I don't think it's helpful to impute motives. I think that there are some other
really important motive could there be, Richard?
There's a lot of others, and I'll finish if you let me. We're not considering parental rights. Parents have the right to know what's being taught in their schools. This is part of what Senate Bill 150 does.
You want to keep the public schools. You better listen to the parents.
The child can opt out,
as well as to
object to that.
This radical group.
Missing the big point of age appropriateness. What is appropriate to teach the different ages? I think of Renee on the last program that we did. We talked about a controversial book that was in one of the Louisville schools, and you had asked me to read a description, and I was embarrassed to read it. It was pornographic. It was obscene. Parents objected to it, but the school board allowed it to continue. I do have an example of something that's age appropriate that I can share on the program, and this was from a link on the KDE's guidance last summer, and this is the genderbread person. And I'm happy to show it, but you can see there's what's supposed to be the gingerbread man. It teaches human sexuality, wherein the brain is identity. It teaches attraction to the heart, and then it teaches sex. This is something that is not geared towards high schoolers or middle schoolers. This is geared towards kindergarten and elementary school students.
Nonsense.
This is the kind of thing that
should never be in the school system.
They're saying, look, my 5-year-old and 6-year-old and 7-year-old, they don't need that taught. Please teach them phonics. Please teach them how to write. Teach them how to read, that kind of thing. They do not want this kind of thing taught, nor do they want gender ideology or sexual orientation promotion in the schools as well, and that's what Senate Bill 150 addresses.
Senator Wise.
I'm going back to the comment that Mr. Hartman made about me was running with Kelly Craft. That's absurd. Once again, I worked with the bill drafters way before the announcement of me coming out as lieutenant governor, but I'm going to say this, all the candidates out there are talking about these issues that run on the Republican ticket.
Not what
because
you all were.
That is what the constituents are talking about, Chris. That is the issues right now.
Do you agree with Kelly Craft?
Allow Senator Wise to finish.
Allowing curriculum transparency, and to not have kindergarten through fifth graders talking about STD, sexually orientation, all the types of things that are out there. These things are right now on the wave of our country. And people are talking about it. And once again, I think it's an issue that I support Daniel Cameron, who's running in November, who I hope is going to continue to take on the charge of these very issues that we brought out, as well as the other candidates on the campaign trail.
Max, what did your running mate mean when she said, quote, under a Kraft-Wise administration, there will be no transgenders in Kentucky schools?
That was her comment, not mine. But Chris, we know something
Oh, buddy, what
was the Kraft-Wise plan to achieve that?
You're a joke.
Senate Bill
Max
150
Wise
was
is a
looking
great
at transgender
senator.
curriculum and all the things to empower parents as it relates to
This
public schools.
You've got a warped
These are the conversations
committee
that are
here,
being had in
even
terms of
talking
parental
about
rights
this, Renee,
and getting back to
shamefully
teaching,
for
getting back to
KET.
reading, studying, and arithmetic, and not about politics of a certain agenda being pushed down certain people. They're not for it. Look at right now our country. People who are just trying to go about their business, going to a Major League Baseball game, the LA Dodgers, they're having to look at all the stuff that's happening with that. There's all types of things that are happening right now with our society that the general public just says, you know what, that's not us.
That's right.
That's going to be
You're destroying the public schools, buddy.
Max co-signed these statements as a party to that ticket. He refused to refute that type of eradication talk. There will be
well, what
no
do you think? What do you think your talk is?
Administration. How are
Shameful.
they going to do this? I mean, that is the type of thing that trans kids are hearing, and then the depression is increasing, and unfortunately, self-harm and suicidal ideation increases when some of the most
my
powerful
goodness
people in our
gracious
state
sakes
say
alive!
things like
You're
you
the
have no
problem.
place in Kentucky schools, and we're going to make certain that you're not there.
So I do want to clarify, Senator Max Wise, you know that not all of those who identify as Republican feel as perhaps you and your former running mate felt. We do know that former state representative Bob Hellringer, who is a lobbyist, who is for the Fairness Campaign, gave a pretty impassioned plea to not pass Senate Bill 150. Also a former state representative from Louisville, Jerry Miller, who was a chairman of the House State Government Committee, also talked about his grandchild identifying as transgender and compelling the General Assembly to not proceed with Senate Bill 150. So it's not that all Republicans perhaps feel the way that some who were running for.
No, there's a lot of Republicans, a vast majority, and a vast majority of Democrats still that are godly principled people.
You know, they had their views about 150. Let's also remember 76 representatives voted for that. There was bipartisanship. There was Democrat that crossed the aisle on that. You had 29 state senators to vote for Senate Bill 150. So 105 voted for it and also overrode the governor's veto on it.
Yes.
So that shows right there in terms of a supermajority that listens to their constituents.
Absolutely.
That are there to work for their districts. They listen and they voted that way.
So, Miss Blankenship, when you hear that those are pretty high numbers, bipartisan.
I don't know Miss Blankenship, whether she's Mr. Blankenship or Miss Blankenship.
That's where Kentucky is trending.
You know,
Are the positions
her
that
biases
you're espousing tonight out of
need to
step
be
with
recognized.
the majority of Kentuckians?
Oh, I think far the opposite. You know, the polls that we've seen on these issues that survey regular
Executive
Kentucky voters
director,
show that most
ban
Kentuckians
conversion
do not buy into
therapy.
this kind of hateful rhetoric and attitudes. You know, the fact that the supermajorities are able to strong arm their caucuses by holding bills hostage, by
Which
threatening not
restrooms
to
does
fund
she
projects
use?
in members' districts and things like this. The fact that that produces these overwhelming votes, I don't think that that's surprising at all. What I do think is surprising is that we end up with bills that are as poorly written as ones like this. You know,
This bill isn't poorly written. It's written to deal with people like you
in Kentucky and not just LGBT
who want to warp
people.
our children's
The
minds
legislature is after, because
into
guess
your
what?
way of life.
If we prohibit all discussion of sexual
A lot of it's called
orientation,
pedophilia.
it's not just gay people that get hit by that. We're going to see things like bans on pro-life clubs. We're going to see bans on church groups coming in to talk about sex and marriage with student groups. You know, we're going to see bans of the Bible. I mean, every Republican in Kentucky had better pray that this bill is not implemented.
Oh,
that they
nonsense.
follow KET's guidance in every school district in this state, because reality is that these
Part of the problems you're already taking the Ten Commandments out of the classrooms, your liberal thoughts.
So I want to get that perspective from Senator Wise. I mean, Miss Blankenship just mentioned where this interpretation could go when it comes to pro-life groups and other groups that perhaps curry favor with the Republican Party. That's not the intent of Senate Bill 150, is it?
No, not at all. We laid out what was specifically stated in Senate Bill 150.
It's very
I
clear,
go back once again.
Renee.
People want to get back to education. They
That's
want
right.
to keep issues like this just out of, especially K through 5 and 6 through 12, as we're talking about this, and giving, once again, parents the right to send their child and children to school and to be able to get back to education. Richard cited numbers a while ago in terms of where we are with testing and things such as that. Get back to the basics. And I'll also say this in terms of, where we are and where we're going. I can't say what the next session is going to bring. If it is just changing this, if that's what needs to be done, that's an easy statutory fix. We do that all the time. But in terms of other issues and other things that may be creeping in and maybe looking at, we'll see what the supermajority has to deal with when we come January.
So that's a good point, because some have wondered, well, what's next and how much further will the Kentucky General Assembly go when it comes to these issues? Are there measures that were part of 470, House Bill 470, that were not included in 150 that you see having some leverage and some gravity for next year's session? Are those discussions already underway to take this even further than it is now?
I think right now what you're seeing, Renee, is we've done a good job with our House and Senate majority leaders to be able to look at the interim and focus on a lot of policy issues. There's a lot of things out there right now that we're facing as Kentuckians. There's issues that deal with, still the flooding and still deal with tornadoes in terms of reimbursement, in terms of us getting us back, us getting us with broadband to make sure that every area of Kentucky's got that. I talked about school safety. I can't say specifically at 470 or the other bills what's going to come about. Every legislator has their priority, Democrat and Republican, to file whatever legislation that they think's a priority for them and for their district. So I can't speak on behalf of other representatives or other senators, but we've got a whole host of issues that we are going to continue to focus on. But once again, a lot gets back to, what's the public demand? What are some of the things that we're hearing? And I will tell you, traveling across the state, there's a lot of people in terms of Senate Bill 150 that we're very pleased to see that we're trying to protect our Kentucky children.
Absolutely.
And Ms. Blankenship, what does this do for your cause to ban conversion therapy, which perhaps had more discussion in the Kentucky General Assembly a few years ago, had a Senate sponsor, I believe, Alice Forgy Kerr, who is no longer in the Kentucky State Senate. Are you pessimistic about the chances of that getting traction in the General Assemblies to come?
No, quite the opposite. In fact, this year we saw more discussion of the issue than we did last year. In particular, because the reality is that the families that are having gender-affirming care, like hormone replacement therapy, banned, are now facing really difficult choices. An earlier draft of House Bill 470 would effectually have required conversion therapy for kids that identify as trans. And so to see, I think, that confronted more directly was important. We also saw people like Dr. Andre Van Mol, a noted conversion therapist, coming to Kentucky to testify in favor of this type of legislation. So, whether we want it or not, this issue is becoming front and center. And I continue to believe that more Republicans than not view that type of practice as heinous and unfair.
Nonsense.
Utah, I think, provides a clear example of maybe the path forward for Kentucky.
A lot of
This year,
Democrats like me
passed a ban on
switched to be
conversion therapy,
Republican
also
because of
gender-affirming
that stuff getting
healthcare.
into our
So I
school
don't think that those
systems.
things are necessarily mutually exclusive from an
We don't
ideological
need that in
perspective.
our
And I
education
hope that the Kentucky
process.
legislature will
We need to
view,
get back to the
this as an
basics, so
opportunity
we're
to do right
actually
by the kids
educating
that hurt
children.
so much this year.
So I want to get your perspective, Mr. Nelson, with the Commonwealth Policy Center. Do you see those as two mutually exclusive issues?
Well, I think sexual orientation change efforts, that's another issue. I want to get back to something more foundational, though. I think there's a conflation of policy that is age appropriate, that affirms parental rights, being interpreted as being against LGBT youth. I think that you have people of goodwill who simply disagree as to what should be taught in the public schools when it comes to gender identity, when it comes to sexual orientation curriculum. And when you conflate the two, you're villainizing for those, and it's been here Chris. You villainize those who simply have a different opinion on this. This is not helpful to the conversation. I think that I can affirm somebody who's a youth who's LGBT identified. I can affirm them and be for them. And I'll say this, I think that in the original guidance that the Kentucky Department of Education had last year, part of their impetus was to affirm LGBT youth and to provide a safe place for them. I can be for that to a degree, but I don't have to disagree with how we get there, or I don't have to agree with them as to how we get there. In fact, when it comes to gender dysphoric youth, I think that the most loving thing that you can do is to help them align with their born biological sex. It is not to give them high doses of hormone therapy. It is not to give them, to steer them towards transition surgery.
Kill kids.
And here's something else, Rebecca, I wanted to mention. There was news during the General Assembly session that there is a gender clinic for youth in Bowling Green that was opening up. Vanderbilt, not very far from Bowling Green, has a gender clinic for youth. They've closed recently because of the blowback as to what they were doing there. That amounts to experimentation, untested experimentation on youth. And that's why Europe is rolling back. You have, I believe it's Finland, Sweden, England. They're putting a halt to gender transition surgery and puberty blockers for minors because of the problems.
That is not true.
We had testimony in the state legislature to that effect.
Ms. Blankenship, respond.
Yeah. So the idea that these treatments are experimental is an outright lie. The first gender-affirming surgery on a trans patient, as we understand it today, occurred in 1922.
You're the liar, ma'am.
Over 100 years
Unfortunately.
ago. Hormone replacement therapy began offered to trans adults in the 1930s. It was in the 1980s that trans youth began to receive puberty blockers, and in the 90s that they became eligible for other forms of hormone replacement therapy. When you characterize these treatments as experimental, you are ignoring decades, in fact, a century of data that proves that they are highly effective and safe, and you are invalidating the life experiences of thousands of people, including Kentuckians, who have experienced these treatments and seen their lives improved as a result. And if you could actually produce evidence that this was a negative practice, I think you would have been able to find a Kentuckian to testify to that effect during the General Assembly. But instead, you had to fly people in all the way from Nebraska. You had to bring people on the Zooms from California who are pseudo doctors. You know, it's offensive to hear you lie about these things. And you know, the reality is this: when you have to bring in a conversion therapist, somebody who advocates a totally discredited practice, something that people like Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud were pioneering and finding to be a failure, you know, I think that really shows the lengths that you're willing to go to ignore science in pursuit of ideological devastation of people that you don't like.
Johns Hopkins University was a pioneer in gender transition for minors and for adults, and they put a halt to it after they discovered the harm that it was causing. Paul McHugh, the psychiatrist in chief there, in an op-ed not too long ago.
Sir, you don't want to.
It's a couple years ago.
I say, ma'am.
Essentially called it close to abuse when children under the age of 18 are pushed towards transitions and given puberty blockers.
Provide gender-affirming care. They certainly do.
The testimony from other states too, people were afraid to testify in Kentucky. They did not want to be singled out. Some were afraid of losing their jobs. They didn't want to be bullied. Those committee hearings were filled with people that were against 150. Very few people from Kentucky were willing to speak out against it. But Luca Hine, who came from Nebraska, who was transitioned when she was 16, had a double mastectomy when she was 16. Shortly after, she was given high doses of testosterone. She's 22 years old, and she is suffering terribly from that treatment.
Mr. Hartman.
So much there. Let me just say this. The consensus among Kentuckians,
this is out of balance.
The only poll that's been done.
You got these two people here who are radicals.
The Mason-Dixon poll that showed
for
71%
this pedophilia stuff
of Kentucky voters
and all this junk in our
the Kentucky General
elementary
Assembly,
and high schools,
and children's access
sexual orientation,
to this medically necessary and supported by every major medical association.
I'm ashamed of KET putting this on with these unbalanced.
On this. Such a small population.
The legislature passed passed the
that
law
was filed by
by a
the
vast
American Medical
majority.
Association, the
Get
American
over it.
Academy of Pediatrics, they estimate only about 140,000 LGBT or transgender kids under the age of 18 eligible for puberty blocking therapy, hormone replacement therapy. I mean, you could practically fit the entire population in Churchill Downs on Kentucky Derby Day, and yet they have acted like this is the most important and pressing issue in conservative politics. Why the focus, the scrutiny on such a small population simply to gain cheap political.
So I do want to ask
nonsense.
Senator Max
Shame
Wise
on you,
that because
sir.
there was a response that came
Shame
from
on
the
you,
Lexington
Renee,
viewer
for
that
letting
asked
these
the
two
question,
people
why are we spending so much
make
time
these
and money on this
false
when Kentucky faces
accusations.
much more serious problems? I'll ask you to answer that question along with the response from comments from Mr. Hartman.
Well, once again, these are issues that have been in the legislature before. If you look at everything in Senate Bill 150, the majority of that were bills that have been previously filed, previous sessions before, and this was just part of a session of where it became a forefront issue. It was that across the entire country. We listen also to our districts. We listen to our constituents. We listen to our base. And that's one of the things, I look at. I'm also a father of 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. And I'm going to tell you where I live and from the district I represent, standing up for bathroom privacy, standing up for parental rights, standing up for curriculum transparency and the things that are happening. I hear that so much from so many. I think that's why you saw
You'll hear it from Northern Kentuckians
That's why you saw the numbers at the way it is.
including myself.
And I would also refer back to the poll that Chris mentioned a while ago. He is correct. That was a Mason-Dixon poll. But I don't think that correctly said that those were likely voters in that poll. I think that those were just registered. Did it say actually likely voters who were going to go vote or not? Because it is an issue. I think that's still going to be a big issue to everyone on this panel tonight as we go forth with this governor's election in November.
And I'm for Daniel Cameron.
Once again, I think families across Kentucky, I think families across the United States are looking at a lot of these different types of issues, and we'll see who's there with the base. It's going to come out.
So finally, Senator Wise, this tweet from Harriet Seiler in Louisville asks, as to teaching sexual health in elementary school, do those who favor SB 150 realize girls may menstruate by the age of 10? What about protective lessons about bad touch?
In terms of the stuff we've got already with child abuse and with some laws and some things that have been put forth with guidance that are already there with our programs within our schools, I think that's something that, hopefully is already there. And these are things that we always can continue to look at as a legislative body as we go forward.
Well, thank you, Senator Wise. I'll allow a quick response, Miss Blankenship, just a final couple of words before we end tonight's conversation.
Certainly. The reality is that this will be litigated in the courts. In the Sixth Circuit, we have ample precedent protecting the rights of LGBT people, including cases like Dodds versus the U.S. Department of Education in 2015, the Smith decision, which affirmed that and quoted that opinion as stating that transgender rights are well established in this circuit. My hope is that the courts will show the same deference to human rights that the Kentucky General Assembly ought to have.
And Mr. Nelson, give you 20, 30 seconds as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Chris mentioned that why are we focusing on these kids? It's because these are permanent choices that will affect them the rest of their lives, and it is worth advocating on their behalf. Children cannot fully appreciate doing a gender transition or having surgical intervention. The public schools should focus on academic excellence. They should root out divisiveness like gender identity programs, and they should invite parents into the educational formation process and respect their rights instead of undermine them.
So I have to
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. Thank you all for this very robust discussion. Thank you, Senator Wise, for joining us from Campbellsville via Skype. Thank you all for being in the studio this evening. It's been a really interesting conversation, and we hope that you've learned from it. Next Monday on Kentucky Tonight, a discussion about the state of the economy. Be sure to join us, of course, each weeknight at 6:30 Eastern, 5:30 Central for Kentucky Edition, or have more of this conversation tomorrow night. And of course, Friday night, Bill Bryan and team of journalists
You want to
discuss the
protect
news
your children
on Comment on Kentucky.
and
I'll
keep
see
your
you
public
soon.
schools
Take
and
care.
protect your teachers. You better support
Quality
Daniel
programming
Cameron
on
for
KET
governor.
is brought to you by viewers like you and Brown Foreman, producer and marketer of premium adult beverages, headquartered in Louisville and selling its brands in more than 170 countries across
Return
the
to
globe. Brown
Commonwealth
Foreman,
and
proud
the nation
Kentucky
to godly
citizen
principles.
since 1870.
Vote for Donald
Kentucky
Trump.
Nurses Association, the only